From the earliest days of the Cold War, the US and NATO air forces deployed large numbers of aerial refueling tankers. The most iconic of these is the ubiquitous KC-135, of which more than 800 were built for strategic and tactical use. When KC-135s entered service in 1957, they supplemented and later replaced 800 KC-97 Strato freighters, which had started operating in 1950, 282 KB-29s, whose service started in 1948, and 248 KB-50s, conversion of which started in 1955. Later in the Cold War, 60 KC-10 extenders joined the fleet in the 1980s. Because of NATO's dependence on flying gas tanks, it's easy to assume that the Soviet Union had the same fleet of aircraft and operating concept. That wouldn't, however, make a terribly interesting video. Maybe the truth doesn't either, but we'll see. The Soviets were as interested in Doohay's theories of strategic air power as most other countries in the interwar period. At vast expense, they constructed 818 TB-3 bombers, designed by the Tupolev OKB in two batches between 1932 and 1937. The TB-3 had a range of 1,200 miles, and it was best described as lumbering. Even so, experiments to extend its range began in the 1930s. Each bomber aircraft would be accompanied by a tanker conversion. Because the TB-3 could only travel at 130 miles an hour, the hose from the tanker could be paid out by hand using a simple reel as the tanker cruised above the receiving aircraft. Another crewman would grab the hose and manually connect it to the tank. A tap and gravity would do the rest. In practice, this was a dangerous, messy, and inefficient method, and it was soon shelved. There was then a decade-long pause in Soviet development of in-flight refueling. It resumed in 1948 as the new Tu-4 Bull approached operational service. For speed, the system in the initial trial was a version of a pre-war British concept referred to at the time as a grapple line looped hose system. In this, the receiving aircraft trailed a steel cable. The tanker followed the receiver in an echelon port formation about 8 to 10 meters back, grappling the cable using a looped cable shot from the aircraft. Having successfully grabbed the cable, the tanker crew reeled it in and then connected the fuel hose to it. The receiver then pulled it back and connected the hose to the fuel tank. In the Soviet system, the tanker then pumped fuel across at a rate of 185 gallons a minute, while maintaining position 12 to 15 meters above the receiving aircraft. The system had been pretty clever before the war, but speeds were now much too high and aircraft were now much too closed for it to be a practical system in the 1950s. After much testing, it was therefore rejected. The process of developing, deploying, and testing it did, however, spawn the two systems that would ultimately be deployed by the Soviet Air Forces during the Cold War. Both would initially see service on versions of the Bull. The first of these resulted in the probe and drogue arrangement that's now standard all over the world. The route that the Soviets took to get there was a bit roundabout, though. At the same time as experiments to extend the Tu-4's range so it could get to the US and back were taking place, there were also attempts to develop a towed fighter that could defend the bombers on the way to their targets. The upshot of this effort was the Burlaki towed fighter project. In Burlaki, some of the Bulls would tow MiG-15s by way of a steel cable with a drogue on the end. The MiG-15 had a harpoon-like attachment on its nose that mated with the cable and allowed the aircraft to be dragged along. Lockheed actually developed a similar system that enabled an F-80 Shooting Star to be towed by a B-37. Burlaki turned out not to be very useful in practice, as it significantly reduced the Bull's speed. The MiG pilots also had a tendency to freeze as their cabin heaters and oxygen systems didn't work without the engine turning. The basic Burlaki system was, however, tried as the basis for a more automated fuel transfer system. This project was actually led by Yakovlev, well connected and influential as ever. The MiG's harpoon was modified to contain a valve and a pipe that led to the fuel system. When the main drogue made contact with the harpoon, another drogue was paid out from the tanker. This also connected to the MiG, locking the main pipe to the aircraft so that fuel would flow. When the fuel stopped, the second drogue automatically disconnected and the fighter could fly free. 3 fuel tanks were fitted in the Bull's bomb bay alongside an inert pressurization system to reduce the risk of fuel vapor igniting in the tanks. 10 flights were made to test the system in 1955. 5 contacts were made and fuel was transferred on 3 occasions before it was decided that the system was excessively complicated and it was abandoned. Fortunately for the Soviet Air Force, in December 1951, the former aircraft designer Semyon Alexeyev started work on a concept that borrowed from, but also significantly simplified, the Yakovlev system. Alexeyev had lost his fighter OKB, number 21, but had been allowed to form a new one, OKB 918, that focused on aircraft systems. What he alighted on for aerial refueling was essentially the same as the classic probe and drogue system. The Bull was modified with 2 hose drum units in the forward bomb bay. Hoses ran from the drums along supporting rollers inside the wings and then exited from specially modified wingtips. The system operator sat in the tail gunner's station, which had the guns replaced with video cameras that recorded the fueling sequence. Because the bomber ran on petrol and the jet fighters on kerosene, the bomber's fuel system was split up to store some of each. 3 MiG-15s were modified with a fixed fuel probe on the port side and the nose. Test flights began in 1953 and they were immediately successful, with a couple of notable exceptions. First, the exact structure of the hose required several iterations. The initial hose was rubber with a spiral of metal wound through it. This proved to be too fragile, but removing the wire entirely unfortunately led to the hose bouncing around too much in the tanker's wake. Trial and error was required to fix this. Even when an acceptable hose was made, the system retained quite a lot of fuel in the hose. When the pump was shut off and the aircraft disconnected, the pilot could expect his canopy to be liberally doused in jet fuel. All of that said, the system was simple and effective. A dozen Tu-4s were converted to use it. The VVS had no need to fuel tactical fighters as their doctrine didn't require long-range missions. Strategic bomber forces were, however, supportive of the concept, and, with one notable exception, they would equip all of their bombers with the appropriate probes at some point in their careers. It was not, however, the only refueling system that entered service. In July 1949, testing began on another system known as wing-to-wing. It's basically how it sounds, and you can see it in action in these videos. The receiving aircraft trails a contact cable about 100 meters long from a fairing on its starboard wingtip. The tanker then closes in from behind, falling into an echelon starboard formation with the bomber and placing its port wing over the cable. The tanker then moves forward so that the cable slides along the wing undersurface onto a boom on the wingtip, engaging a ring connected by springs to the fitting at the hose's outer end. Via a slightly Heath-Robinson arrangement, the fitting then slides up and connects the hose to the fueling point located under the bomber's wing. The transfer pump could then be started. Transfer rate was about 210 gallons a minute, and a maximum of 2,750 gallons could be transferred at a time. It's a more complicated system than the probe and drogue, requiring excellent spatial coordination as the 2 aircraft flew alongside each other at 200 miles an hour. As the aircraft approached the contact cable deployed by the bomber, the pilot's instinct would be to focus on the port wingtip. This risked a mid-air collision and was ultimately corrected by developing teamwork between the pilot and the gunner in the ventral station, who could use one of the windows on the tanker's side to help the pilot position the aircraft. After a while, 10 missions was the standard, pilots did get used to the maneuver, but it wasn't as easy for the tanker crew as probe and drogue. A smaller but still important issue concerned the number of aircraft that could be fueled on a single mission. Because the ring would be left attached to the cable on the receiving aircraft, and the tanker only had 3 rings aboard, only 3 aircraft could be refueled before the tanker needed to return to base. This limited operational flexibility. Despite the downsides, wing-to-wing did have 2 major benefits. Because the aircraft are laterally separated, turbulence is less of a factor. And because only the tanker crew was maneuvering while the receiving aircraft flew a straight course, the tanker crew built up a lot of skill, which made the maneuver more effective in general. It was, however, less successful when MiG-19s were tried as receiving aircraft. Maneuvering a Tu-4 around a small aircraft wasn't as easy. By the time that all the trials were completed and the modifications were made, the Bull was essentially obsolete, so only 3 tankers and 3 bombers were modified to make use of the system. But as you've seen in some of the videos, the main reason for this was the Tu-16 Badger, which was entering widespread service, alongside the heavier Tu-95 Bear and the M4 Bison. The Badger's main issue as a platform was also lack of range. So in 1954, two Tu-16s were adapted as a tanker and a receiver aircraft, and they were ready for trials in January 1955. Adapting and improving the system was a laborious process that took 18 months. The receiver now placed its port wing on the hose and manoeuvred so that the hose slid along the wing until it was stopped by a fitting under the wingtip. The hose was then rewound by the cable until it was automatically connected to the receiver aircraft's refuelling receptacle. When this was done, the aircraft flew in close formation with the tanker slightly ahead of it. The co-pilots of the two aircraft monitored the refuelling while the captains flew the aircraft. In its eventual production form, the Tu-16Z had a normal takeoff weight of 167,000 pounds, of which 54,000 was fuel. That's about 3,750 gallons of fuel. Eventually, a third of the Tu-16 bombers built were modified to receive fuel in this way. 114 aircraft were modified into tankers. A single refuelling increased range by 1,200 miles, a second by a little less when reserve margins and fuel burned during the tanking process were taken into account. Crews practiced receiving fuel as a standard part of their missions. The impact of in-flight refuelling was most apparent for crews executing maritime patrol and strike missions. With two refuelings, a Badger based in the Kola Peninsula could operate in the Atlantic, several hundred miles south of Iceland. Without being able to refuel, they were restricted to operations in the Barents Sea and the northern portion of the Norwegian Sea. That's a fundamental strategic difference between purely defensive operations and the possibility of offensive ones. Trials were also conducted with the modified MiG-19s using a 50mm rather than an 88mm hose to reduce fuel flow. The tests were successful, and MiG-19 mission duration could be extended from under 2 hours to approaching 6. Again, the VVS saw little merit in this as they had no intention of using the MiG-19 in an air superiority role. At the other end of the size spectrum, the mighty Myasishchev M4 Bison entered service around 1954. Fully loaded, the M4 weighed over 400,000 pounds. Amongst this weight was 32,500 gallons of fuel, enough to take the Bison 6,000 miles. Although that sounds impressive, it was in fact insufficient for an aircraft that needed to go up over the pole from Engels to attack a US city and then return. The original specification for the Bison had demanded 7,500 mile range, and the competing Tu-95 Bear boasted over 8,000. The most obvious solution would have been for the M4 to be fitted with the same wing-to-wing fueling system as that found on the Tu-4 and Tu-16. Obvious it might have been, but Vladimir Myasishchev and Andrei Tupolev were bitter enemies. If Tupolev found out what his rival was planning, then he would certainly use it as justification to dispense with the Bison altogether. Instead, Alexeyev developed a version of their probe and drogue system for the M4. In this instance, the fuel hose assembly was removable and could be installed in the Bison's bomb bay. A 164-foot hose strung out behind the aircraft from the open bay, and fueling operations were controlled by the tail gunner. The drogue on the end of the hose was carefully designed to reduce its movement in the aircraft's slipstream. Everything in the system was hydraulically actuated. The complete assembly, minus the tail gunner, who was seen as a separate piece of equipment, was known as the CAS, or Self-Contained Refueling Pack. Delivery rate was necessarily high at 440 gallons a minute via the receiving aircraft's probe, which was mounted on the nose and protruded well out ahead of the aircraft. To improve connection, the probe was telescopic and was fired into the drogue via a pneumatic system. A locking mechanism then activated and fuel began to flow. Although testing was generally okay, the system was far from flawless when it was initially deployed. Hoses had a tendency to snap. The best case when this happened was that the drogue remained attached to the probe. The worst case was that the hose lashed the aircraft surfaces like a whip, covering them in fuel as it did so. For good measure, it might also wrap itself around the receiving aircraft's horizontal tail, damaging control surfaces. Because the power of Soviet bombers was a major propaganda and superpower signaling tool, the prototype aircraft made an appearance at the Tushino Air Show in July 1956. But public appearances aside, the Alexeyev system was not actually deployed operationally on the M4. Myasishchev OKB themselves developed an alternative system and tested it in 1957. In the February 1957 test, the system was used to transfer 77,000 pounds of fuel to another Bison on its way out to a simulated strike, and another 53,000 pounds on the way back. As a result, the aircraft did an impressive 9,000-mile round trip, which was pretty decent. Because the improved 3M Bison and the Tu-95 were regarded as the more effective and survivable bombers, all of the remaining 32 M4 aircraft were converted into tankers. They could, of course, be converted back to bombers if required, but the redesignated M4-2s never appear to have been so. After the M4 Bison came the logically named 3M Bison. This had many upgrades to increase range and performance. Unfortunately, a key one of these changes was supposed to be the engines, but because in the late 1950s jet engines were a constant source of disappointment to aircraft designers, the desired motors were not available in quantity, and some, I believe around 10 of the new 3Ms, were delivered with older engines from the M4. One, in fact, had 2 new engines on one side and 2 old engines on the other. These aircraft were designated 3MS-1, and in the 1970s the majority of these aircraft were also converted for use as tankers, designated the 3MS-2. The 3MN-1, equipped with the intended engines, could also be used in this way through installation of the removable CAS kit, and it was designated 3MN-2 when it had that in there. Curiously, the only combat use of the Bison occurred in Afghanistan, when some of the 3MS aircraft were converted back to bombers and used to carpet bomb Mujahideen positions. Otherwise, the Bison refuelling fleet, which peaked at around 50 aircraft, numbers are a little hazy for the Bison, were the backbone of the strategic refuelling fleet into the 1980s. In theory, they could also refuel VVS fighters or PVO interceptors, as trials did take place back in the 1950s, but in practice I doubt this was ever done very much, as basically no Soviet tactical aircraft had a refueling probe. The next medium bomber introduced into Soviet service was the Tu-22 series, and based on the Politburo's decision back in 1953, these were all designed with in-flight refueling as a basic principle of operation. The geometry of the Tu-22 meant that only a probe and drogue setup was really feasible. Initially, the 3MS-2 tankers were used to tank the backfire fleet, but after a few years of operations, the downsides of this combination were very apparent. Because of their large size and primary role supporting the heavy nuclear bomber fleet, the Bisons were all based at Engels, which had a sufficiently long runway and the necessary maintenance facilities. The backfires were generally based further west and on the coasts. In order to support them, the valuable Bisons had to fly over most of European Russia, which reduced flexibility of operations and the tanker's ability to loiter. So the refueling system from the Bison was adapted for use on the smaller Badger, which could deploy from the same fields as the blinders and backfires. Fuel transfer capacity of this Tu-16N was 5,100 gallons, a third more than the Tu-16Z. Topping up using the Badger tankers gave the backfire 5,300 miles of range to play with. Despite the significant operational advantages, the need to support the Badger fleet meant that only 23 Badger bombers were converted to N standard. A further 20 Tu-16Zs were converted to use a similar probe and drogue setup. These were known as Tu-16NN, but in service the two types were just referred to as Tu-16N, as they were functionally identical. Badger tankers continued in service to the end of the Cold War, but were rapidly retired thereafter. For the most part, these aircraft were deployed as part of the strategic deterrent. The exception was the use of Badgers to support the activities of both Badger and backfire naval attack aircraft. This wasn't just Soviet resource prioritization. As I said, up to the MiG-23, the VVS fighter force was essentially there to provide point defense over bases that supported tactical attack and strike aircraft. Upgraded versions of the Su-24, however, had refueling probes that would allow them to fuel from a Tu-16N or one of the Bisons. These aircraft were, however, not very suited for tactical operations. Setting aside the Bison's rarity, basing and vast size, both types had only a single fueling point. Refueling a tactical flight would therefore take far too long. Western tankers had by this point 3 points for refueling. The VVS decided that it would need something similar to support fourth-generation fighters. As the Ilyushin IL-76 took shape in 1968, the VVS explored whether it could be developed into a tactical tanker. Their conclusion was that the original IL-76 lacked the lifting capacity required to be an effective tanker, as it could only transfer 22,000 pounds of fuel. A decade later, however, the high-capacity IL-76MD began to enter service. This was much more promising. So in March 1982, the Politburo issued instructions to begin development of a transport and tanker variant of the aircraft, designated IL-78. NATO would later call it the Midas. Design work took a year. The result was an aircraft that carried 3 UPAS-1A Sakhalin refueling pods. One was on a conventional pylon under each wing, the other on a short horizontal pylon on the port side of the aft fuselage. Each pod had an 85-foot-long hose and a flexible drogue. They were powered by a pair of ram air turbines. One of those ran the hose drum, the other the generator for the electric transfer pump. This arrangement allowed 265 gallons per minute to be transferred from each pod under normal circumstances, although it could go up to 580 gallons a minute if needed. The gunner's station was removed so that the refueling system's operator could work in that location. Most of the fuel simply came from the IL-78's wing tanks, but 2 large cylindrical metal tanks were also installed in the cargo compartment. These could be removed to allow the aircraft to drop paratroops. Interestingly, the IL-78 could also fuel other aircraft and helicopters on the ground. Given that the IL-78 retained the 76's short and rough field capabilities, this would likely have been useful in support of air mobile operations. Total transferable fuel capacity was 29,500 gallons with the cargo compartment tanks installed, or 20,000 gallons without them. Takeoff weight was 419,000 pounds from a paved runway, or 347,000 from an unprepared strip. It was thus a big bird, although 15% greater mass than a KC-135 brought no more transferable fuel capacity. In a more typical role, where it would transfer 20,000 gallons of fuel, combat radius was 650 miles. Transferring 12,000 gallons, it could extend that out to 1,500 miles. That much fuel would be enough to refuel one Tu-95 or backfire, although all of the bomber versions of these aircraft had their refueling probes removed as part of the SALT II nuclear talks. Bombers were fueled using the fuselage pod, but Bears apparently rarely used the Midas as a tanker in period because of exhaust gas ingestion issues caused by that location. 2 fighters could use the wing pods simultaneously. Deliveries to the VVS began in 1984. 38 aircraft were constructed. Soon after it began flight tests, the Council of Ministers ordered the development of a dedicated tanker version of the IL-78 that traded the ability to carry cargo for greater fuel capacity. 36,300 gallons could now be transferred, and maximum takeoff weight went up to 462,000 pounds. Improved UPAS-1M pods increased transfer rate to 618 gallons per minute. Although generally the same to look at as the IL-78, the M can be distinguished by the fact that it lacks the port side entry door on the fuselage, since paratroops won't be jumping out of it. The cargo doors are also deleted, and the fuselage pod is mounted on an L-shaped rather than a horizontal pylon to reduce turbulence. The IL-78M flew for the first time in March 1987, and by 1992 and the end of communism, a dozen aircraft were in service, all at Engels. In running through this, I think the differences in tactical doctrine are evident on the 2 sides of the Warsaw Pact. From the 1950s onwards, NATO could call on many hundreds of tankers to support its European operations. If we assume that the Bisons would not be used anywhere near a European battlefield, at their peak in the 1980s, the Soviets and their Warsaw Pact allies could muster only 40 Midases plus another 40 Badgers with probe and drogue. The latter were only single-point capable, and they could only transfer a sixth of the fuel of a KC-135. Even by this stage of the Cold War, most Soviet aircraft still lacked in-flight refueling capability. Conversely, almost all NATO aircraft had such facilities. Of course, reinforcing the Soviet front line from the country's interior was rather easier than the situation found in NATO. Aircraft could hop from base to base, whereas the Atlantic doesn't allow such behaviour and does require tankers. If they were advancing, Soviet tactical aircraft could and would have used less well-prepared strips. NATO aircraft, preferring a paved runway, would have stayed back and tanked on the way to the battlefield. US strike packages were also much more complicated even than those of their allies, let alone the Soviets, requiring more time to assemble but containing a far more complete set of capabilities. But assembling that package requires tankers, of course. Anyway, hopefully this has been a useful departure into a subject that most of us didn't wake up this week expecting to explore. Soviet tactical tankers. It's a strange gig, this.